Good afternoon from London on a beautiful spring day, and thanks for joining the Nest Centre midweek briefing. I'm John Lough. With international attention heavily focused on the Middle East, Ukraine has slipped down the agenda. Of course, the war in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine are connected, and the obvious question is to what extent the former will influence the latter. At first sight, it looks as though Putin is set to gain significantly from Trump's decision to intervene in Iran for at least three reasons. First, as we discussed last week, there is the economic upside from higher oil prices. This might be short-lived, but it will certainly help reduce the budget deficit. Second, Ukraine is going to struggle to receive more Patriot interceptor missiles, its best defense against Russian ballistic missile attacks that have caused so much damage to its energy infrastructure over the winter. Third, Ukraine's European allies may struggle to provide adequate levels of financial and military support, given the additional pressures governments are going to face to soften the blow of high energy prices. But will these pressures bring Putin closer to his goal of defeating Ukraine? On the Ukrainian side, it's noticeable that there is greater confidence than a few months ago that they can hold the front line. The Ukrainians have increased their medium-range drone and missile strikes, which are destroying some Russian air defenses, as well as disrupting the preparations for the Russian army's spring-summer offensive. And the Ukrainians believe that disrupting the summer offensive can, in fact, seriously damage overall the Russian army's offensive capabilities and force Putin to stop the fighting. To discuss the situation and how to read it, particularly from Moscow's perspective, we're delighted to have back with us today Arkady Ostrovsky. Arkady is the Russia and Eastern Europe editor for The Economist, and he leads the paper's coverage of Russia's war against Ukraine. Welcome back, Arkady. It's great to have you with us.
Great to be with you, John, and thank you for inviting me. I have to correct, I'm obviously not the only person who's doing the Russia coverage, the Economist coverage of Ukraine. We have a wonderful team
No, I didn't mean to suggest you're a sole trader here, as it were. Not at all. But before we start, Arkady, I just need to remind our audience that you can use the chat function to ask questions or provide comments. Arkady can't see these, but I will endeavor to bring them to his attention. Arkady, let's dive in. I was struck this week by President Zelensky's comment that he had, in his words, a very bad feeling about the impact of the conflict in the Middle East on the war in Ukraine. And Zelensky isn't somebody who normally uses this sort of language. He tries to sound upbeat for obvious reasons. Do you think this pessimism he expressed is justified?
I think it is justified, John. I think we're dealing with a kind of a multi-dimension we're trying to decipher sort of a 3D picture. And I think your introduction is absolutely right, that these wars are connected. And of course, it doesn't, the boost that Putin's got from the war in Iran and the higher oil prices does not make it easier, more winnable on the front. And I think there is this realization in Moscow that this war is in a kind of a deadlock. I think what Zelensky is right about is not just all the things that you've listed. The higher oil prices, the fewer interceptors, possibly softening support for Ukraine in some European capitals. But it's the relationship. I think that what's important is to look at the bilateral relationship between Russia and America, and the way that Putin uses this war, uses Iran to gain advantage in Ukraine. So I think the usual perspective is Iran is Russia's ally, that Russia supplied intelligence and some weapon systems to Iran. I think for Putin, Iran is an asset first and foremost. It's an asset that can be traded, and it can be entered into negotiations with the US over Ukraine. And I think that's what is happening at the moment behind the scenes is that basically Putin is trying to trade Iran and his, as he presents it, support, or certainly not making it harder for America, for greater pressure that Trump can apply on Zelensky and on Ukraine. I think that's what Zelensky is probably referring to, is that the bilateral dealing between the two countries, Putin using America, the fact that America is overstretched, to gain a stronger position in negotiations with America over Ukraine. To put it very simply, I think the pressure is mounting. I think Ukraine, we're coming to the moment of truth where America is, Trump is going to throw Ukraine under the bus if he hasn't already. How Europe responds is another matter, but I think it will be hard to hold the line without America's support. So I think the pressure on Ukraine to cede territory, to fold in, to give Putin what he wants, to allow Putin to gain what he couldn't gain on the battlefield is mounting. I think sanctions are likely to be lifted. And if America lifts the sanctions, the EU doesn't have really the mechanism to enforce them. So I think, yes, I think that is a fair description from Zelensky, that this is very disadvantageous for Ukraine.
I mean, that's an interesting argument you make there about what Putin can effectively sort of give in terms of Iran to get from Trump, in Ukraine. But does Putin really have that leverage over the Iranians?
That's a good question. Certainly, I think Putin not supplying before certain weapon systems like S-400 air defense system to Iran is a factor. I think Putin is very good at, as we know, at bluffing, and he's using the threat, or withdrawing threat, as it were, as leverage. He might, it's very hard to prove the negative. But if basically he tells Trump, we could make your life harder, but we're not going to do that, we will never know whether Russia actually had the leverage and whether it would have made it a significant difference. As I said, it's very hard to prove the negative, but he has certainly put it on the table. Put it this way, Russia's position towards Iran was significant enough for Trump and for some European leaders. I understand that Macron called Putin to talk just about Iran a few weeks before the war, the special operation, in this case, Trump's special operation. So whether it's real or not, it's perceived as tangible and different from Venezuela, for example, where I think that was just a complete bluff and that was kind of brushed aside. I think here Russia's position is taken more seriously. Yes.
Yeah. Although I imagine that Moscow cannot possibly have guessed that Trump would dig himself into such an enormous hole in Iran so quickly.
No, absolutely. And, we've been discussing The Economist. We have a leader article this week about what this means for Trump and for American politics. And when my colleagues and I were discussing it on Monday, and we were discussing how this got planned and how Trump got stuck in it, and what a folly it was, and I couldn't help thinking, I'm hearing about Putin and Russia, and the fact that the language of it is a good kind of sign. there is an overlap, personalistic power, resentment, anger, reliance on instinct rather than on proper analysis. Um, all things are in common, and the fact that this is, some of the language which we heard from Donald Trump as he started it, and the language that Putin used as he went into Ukraine. Obviously, these wars are different, but the some features of personalistic power and how they describe it is strikingly similar. No, Putin couldn't have guessed it. I think he probably himself was quite bemused by how similar the language is. And America and Russia have been, Russia has always been mirroring the US. So it's sort of now we have, yes, two personalistic kind of leaders stuck in two very ill thought wars without knowing how to get out of them. Putin, as you know, is an opportunist, and no, he couldn't foresee it, but he knows how to use the situation.
Well, let's just move on. I mean, you refer to what might now happen in Ukraine. I was very struck by the comment by the Finnish president Alexander Stubb, who was in London earlier this week. He spoke at Chatham House, and he said the peace talks on Ukraine were close to reaching what he described as a moment of truth. And he outlined two possibilities. Ukraine is either forced to accept a bad deal, or the talks simply collapse. And then, as you suggest, Europe is left to hold the baby. And it would then have to provide more financial support, more weapons, more intelligence. And that's going to probably put a huge burden on the principal allies of Ukraine in Europe, because they're going to be very stretched at home. The peace talks, as I understand it, have been suspended for now. The Russian side is saying, well, when the American intermediaries, is how I think Peskov described them, are ready to come back to the table, we'll be there. But it doesn't look as though, at least for now, much is going to happen, because, I mean, clearly, Trump and his close entourage are going to be very distracted by Iran, I imagine, for a few weeks at least. But do you think the Kremlin believes that Europe's just going to lose the will to support Ukraine in the way that it has over the last 4 years?
Uh, John, it's very hard to know exactly what they think, but the signs are there, and it's not just you described the economic burden on Europe, which would be immense. I think Stuber is absolutely right. I think this is a moment of truth coming very, very quickly, because the minute, if let's say there is a bad deal and Ukraine is forced by America to accept it, that's the moment when Europe can't just say, let's play for time. It really now needs to come up with the goods. I'm not sure the political situation in Europe allows for this. I think with the cost, now particularly with the cost of living is going to rise because of the energy prices. We already see the rhetoric in some European capitals, sort of irritation with Zelensky building up. I think the centre is struggling to hold its position in European politics. I think it will be very hard. It'll be very hard sell. I don't think that there is a mandate, that the European leaders have the mandate to throw all kind of their effort to support Ukraine when the economy is under pressure. So yes, that's exactly what Putin is hoping for. It's I think he feels probably that he is closer to reaching his goal in terms of splitting America and Europe, and in terms of the softening of the European support for Ukraine. I think yes. What is striking to me is how that picture contrasts with what we're seeing inside Russia, and with the threats, perceived threats, perhaps, by Putin's security entourage. Because you've started quite rightly saying, this is a bonus for Putin, and we just talked about some of this. But the reaction inside, what's happening inside Russia, actually betrays greater nervousness and vulnerability than I've seen for some time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is a sort of bizarre corollary almost, isn't it? That seemingly externally things are very much going in Russia's favor with regard to Ukraine and the Americans getting bogged down in the Middle East. I mean, a sort of perfect scenario in some ways. And now it looks to me very much as though Europe might start thinking more seriously about in buying Russian gas again if the situation continues and the Iranians, attack the gas processing facilities in Qatar. I mean, this is very, very serious for the global gas market. So things in a way couldn't be going better. But then, as you say, domestically, there are real signs of nervousness. In Moscow now, for what, almost 2 weeks, the mobile internet has been severely disrupted for alleged security reasons. And there still seems to be no clarity around why exactly they felt the need to shut down substantially the mobile internet. Is it fear of another terrorist attack? Is it fear of Ukrainian drones or missiles being better targeted on Moscow? I simply don't know. But there's clearly something going on. And then, a pro-Kremlin blogger just a couple of days ago coming out with a message that seemed diametrically opposed to what he'd been saying for years previously, and saying that, Putin was a war criminal and a thief who needed to be brought to justice. I mean, I think this has left people really sort of rather stunned. And allegedly, this gentleman is now in a psychiatric hospital, I read today.
Yes,
But
that's right.
it does feel as though something is going on there in the background.
It is, and it reminds me of it has a certain sort of echo of Prigozhin's mutiny. Um, I'm not saying that this is going to translate into actual troops, moving towards Moscow, but in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of the moment, it is very interesting and it's noteworthy. I would suggest there are two explanations, at least in my mind, for that fear, and I think it is security services, security entourage around Putin responding to those two fears. One is, as I said, is the sense that this war is stuck. And stagnation, when there's been so little gain and so high a cost to this war, is dangerous for Putin because it's becoming very apparent. And the question is building up. It's very apparent that he hasn't achieved the goals, and the costs are becoming more apparent as well. And the question of what was it all for is, I think, if not being has not yet become something that everybody talks about, but it's in people's minds. The tiredness of this war is building up. Levada and Novaya Gazeta had a very interesting poll recently, which suggests that 73% of Russia's population is just completely exhausted by this war. Now, this is the same figures as support for the war. So the true kind of the lack of support is starting to come out as well. Stagnation, as I said, in a war is dangerous, particularly when the goals are not achieved. I mean, not achieving the goals is, you could say, is a defeat. You could say it's a loss. So there is nervousness around that, and how Putin will respond is another subject we could discuss. I think there will be escalation. There will be attempt to escalate. The second reason is what's happening in Iran, because the Kremlin has, from the start of Russia's war against Ukraine, the Kremlin chosen Iran as a role model of a besieged fortress, both in terms of the evading sanctions and in terms of the ideological control and control over the internet. I mean, the internet developed in a very similar way. It's not the Chinese model. It's imposing restrictions and then this whitelist when everything is blocked and you're allowed onto into permitted sites. So whether justified or not, but the security apparatus, and it's, you could say, the FSBs or the FSO, the security guards, the Praetorian guards around Putin, actually have quite a lot in common with the Revolutionary Guard. They are projecting onto themselves. And they're seeing what happened when they obviously see the level of penetration by the Israeli by Mossad in Iran. They can see all that's happening, all the targeting, and they are thinking about themselves. It's inevitable. So they are responding to those threats. Now, what's really interesting is Russia is now, I think, in a situation, or the Kremlin is in a situation where their response to a threat actually creates greater jeopardy for themselves. I mean, the result of the fallout from those bans of the blocking of the outages of mobile internet and the attempts to ban Telegram, which is this huge media platform, is that basically the security services have really upset the equilibrium that the Kremlin has tried to maintain for so long. And the equilibrium between, yes, there is a special military operation, but but life of ordinary Russians should not be affected by it. Yes, there was mobilization that was unpopular. Yes, the frontline regions are, experiencing it very differently. But in big cities, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg and Ekaterinburg, I mean, life went as normal. Now, for the first time, this war has affected everybody, and in Moscow, which is completely digitized. So the loyal put it this way, the people who were at least complicit, or the people who were sort of complying with this war, are now being politicized and angered in the way that the Kremlin had tried to avoid all this time. So the system I think, is out of balance. And you could see it not just in the reaction of ordinary Muscovites, or reaction of the Z bloggers, the war bloggers on Telegram, but also within the government itself. I mean, I was very struck by the comments made by Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, Putin's press secretary, who said, "Well, hang on a second. If we ban Telegram, how are we going to reach the audience of the global South, and how are we going to spread our propaganda?" This is very interesting. I mean, basically what he is saying, he is showing that there is a different party, or there are two different views on this, that there is security services who just, obsessed with security of one man. And there is a kind of a logic and the political system which doesn't share those goals. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the symptoms of the system sort of being out of sync.
Yeah, I agree. We're certainly seeing some signs of some serious dysfunctionality. Arkady, we had a couple of questions that have come in related more to the course of the war. Rex Wempen asks, can you comment on the extent to which Ukrainian drone and cyber capabilities may be able to change the strategic equation by disrupting Russian energy distribution beyond the occasional Mediterranean or Black Sea drone attack? And I mean, it's clear that the Ukrainians have really upped their game recently in terms of their drone and missile capabilities, and are attacking, more energy assets in Russia itself. Any thoughts on that, on what sort of impact that might be having?
I don't think that's going to be the main factor. I think, yes, Ukrainians have clearly now greater capabilities, both cyber and in terms of drones. Whether that in itself substantial to change Putin calculus, I don't think it is. I think that there are now forces at play which are greater than that. And as I said, I think the factor which we should think about very seriously is, what does it mean if Putin feels he is stuck in this war? What's his next move is likely to be? Because if one thing we know from Putin and from Russian military is that when they don't achieve their goals, they don't change the goals. They just go in a different way of achieving them. So I think the temptation for him to escalate, not in Ukraine necessarily, but elsewhere, is very considerable. And I'm very worried about what might happen in the Baltic now, in the Baltic Sea, in the Baltic region, because, as I said, Putin is always mirrored America. I think he's seeing what's happening in Cuba. I think the temptation for him to respond not where we expect him to do, not in Ukraine, is actually very, very serious.
No, I agree that possibility is to be taken seriously. Anders Osland asks, perhaps rhetorically, does the US really have any significance any longer? It does nothing for Ukraine and is so obviously on the Russian side. Will Ukraine or Europe really be listening to Trump any longer? Aren't we likely to see Ukraine and Europe saying, as on the Iran war, why should we pay any attention to you?
Um, I think it is very rhetorical from Anders. America is a superpower. No, Europe has not used 4 years of this war to really increase their capacity, their military industrial capacity. It came too late. The reliance on America has been too great. Um, it's not, yes, America might not be what it used to be, and is certainly now being, I think its power has been tested in Iran. But it's not that I'm not at all sure that in fact, I'm sure they can't, the European powers cannot um, replace it at this stage. I think that's to me is clear. America might not be able to have much. America might not have that much leverage, but neither do European countries have significant enough military power to do it on their own. Yes, there are economies which are whatever you could tell, 10 times larger than Russia, but as Radek Sikorski once said, it's not about how much money you have, it's whether you've transformed your military industrial sector. It's whether you have the industrial capacity. You need to turn it into stuff, and it has not been turned into stuff.
No, I mean, it's happening very slowly. In the case of Germany, we can certainly see a degree of progress, but Europe is still way behind the curve. I absolutely agree. Which, in a way, brings me to a question that I cannot still answer satisfactorily for myself, which is why Russia has not been able to make more rapid progress in Ukraine. I mean, it has an economy that's at least 10 times the size of Ukraine's. It has a numerically superior army, a vastly bigger military industrial complex. And even with a degree of Western assistance that one has to say overall has been pretty paltry. I mean, Ukraine, of course, is in a vastly inferior position. So why is it that Russia hasn't been? I mean, it's taken 4 years to get this far. And last year, there is a statistic that Russia conquered something like 1.5% of Ukraine's territory, and it cost, in terms of casualties, 1 million men. I mean, this is not a good indication of progress.
No, but that's well, partly is for the reasons that the war has changed, and Russia has lost its advantage in terms of the manpower because of the drone technology, which basically cancelled it. I mean, Russia doesn't have. Yes, Russian infantry could be much large. Is much larger force, but it's useless now. When you have a kill zone, when the robots in the sky, the evolution of war in itself brought the two sides to a stalemate without Russia being able to exploit its advantage of greater manpower. But let's just remember, John, that in terms of the what great powers can do or cannot do when they start wars of aggression, the wars of choice, for reasons of preserving their own power. Let's remember what happened to the Soviet Union, which was much larger than Russia, had greater resources when it tried to fight Afghanistan in 1980s. Afghanistan was a weaker and smaller country than Ukraine. The Soviet Union was larger and more powerful than Russia. Yet, 5-6 years into that war, it became clear that the Soviet Union can't win it. Let's look at the war that America had started in Afghanistan 2 decades later. It had to leave. Let's look at what's happening in Iran. Just because you're bigger and more powerful doesn't mean you can win a war, particularly when you start a war of choice, a war of aggression, and you're fighting people who are who are fighting for their survival. For Ukraine, it has always been a war of survival. It's a much more existential. Um, that's one of the main reasons, and this war has never become popular. It never became it never became a great patriotic war. For Ukraine, it's become a patriotic war to a certain extent, but for Russia, it never did. It was very badly planned. It was planned in secret. It was a special military operation which did not have the backing of, I'm not even saying the people, but the key institutions, even the government or the elites. It was, I think it's a failed operation. The problem is that Putin is now, his power and life in a way depends on its outcome. And I fear that that's what also now is happening in terms of power dynamic, is what's happening in America's war in Iran. I mean, the parallels are, they're very different, different wars, different regimes, different countries. But in terms of how the two big powers went into it, there are similarities.
Oh yeah, there are certainly some very, very strong parallels there. I entirely agree. Arkady, look, we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today and for your very clear answers. It's always great to have your perspective.
Great to be with you, John.
So let's do it again. Meanwhile, the briefing will be back next Thursday at the usual time. Katya Glod will be moderating, since I will be in Washington next week, where I hope to see perhaps some of our audience. So I'll be back again in 2 weeks' time. I look forward to speaking to you then. Thank you.